course is going to help you use. Welcome to our B1 Intermediate English course. My name is Alita Zaniolo, and this is my second course with Platzi. I am so excited to start this course with you. But what can you expect from it? Let's take a look at our next slide. As you see here, this course has 4 modules. The first one is countable or uncountable. Have you ever been confused about what is considered countable and uncountable? Maybe using words like many and much or some and any? This course is going to help you use them in a more comfortable way. We're going to clear up all those questions about countable and uncountable features. In our second module, we're going to talk about time. Why is it important to talk about time? Well, we do it every day, all the time. We talk about future plans. We talk about things we've done in the past. We talk about our work experience. So in this course, we're going to learn how to do this in a comfortable and confident way. In our third module, we have descriptions. And whether you're at work or just with friends, we're often comparing 2 different products, comparing ideas, and we're describing activities, even for an example, work projects. So this module is really going to help you do that with confidence. Our fourth module is about talking about abilities and expectations, and this is so important in your professional career. You have to be able to talk about the things that you know how to do, and you have to be able to talk about what is expected from others and also what you expect. So again, this course is going to help you in so many aspects, and it's really going to help you in your professional career. Before starting our first class, I have something special for you. In the extra resources, you will find a diagnostic exam or a quiz. What kind of a quiz is this? Well, if you take it now, you're going to be able to see the progress you make. So at the end of the course, you'll have another opportunity to see and to take this kind of exam again. So in the meantime, before starting the class, go and take this exam and check your score. Now keep those results and that exam with you so that when you finish the course, you can compare and you can see how much you've progressed. Without further ado, let's start our first module. Welcome to our first module in this course. The module's title is Countable or Uncountable. Have you ever had a hard time understanding what is countable and what is an uncountable noun in English? You are not alone. But in this following module, we're going to see exactly how it works inside an English person's mind. So without further ado, let's start our first class. Many or much? What's the difference? Well, the difference is, are we talking about something that's countable or uncountable? So as mentioned before, it's not always easy to identify which one is which. So in this class, we're going to learn, first of all, what is an uncountable or uncountable noun, and then we're going to see when we should use many and when we should use much. So let's look at our next slide. Here are some things that can help us identify which is which. When we're talking about something countable, it's usually something that can be counted. Something to help you with this is thinking, does it have a singular and a plural form? For an example, there's 1 apple and there's 2 apples. So apple has a singular and plural form and is something that is countable. What about things that are uncountable? Things that are uncountable are often things that are abstract. For an example, feelings are something abstract and they're also uncountable. Another thing that could be uncountable is something that is made of particles that are too small or too numerous to count. What does that mean? Well, don't worry, we're going to see that in the next slides. So let's start with what is countable. Again, we see things that can be counted. For an example, if you look in this picture, you see 1 person near the bookshelf, and you see 2 people in the park. So again, person or people are countable nouns. What else is countable here? Well, again, we already said this rule. If you can think that something has a plural and a singular form, then it's probably something that is countable. For an example, what do you see in the bookshelf? We see books. You can have 1 book, but you can also have 5 books. And again, book is the singular form, and books is the plural form. It would be the same with plants. As you see, again, on the bookshelf, there are 2 plants. And once again, this is something that is countable. Let's look at what is uncountable. Uncountable things are things that are abstract. For an example, love. We don't have 1 love and 2 loves, and you can't really count how much love there is. You can say a lot of love or a little bit of love, but you can't really quantify it as you would for something countable. Another thing is things that are made of particles that are too numerous to count. What could be an example of this? Well, one that many language learners get wrong is information. See, many people think, well, you can count information, but really you can't. In an English person's mind, there's so much information out there that it is impossible to count. In fact, there's no such word as informations. No, it's only information, whether we're talking about 1 piece of information or several. Okay, so now let's look at some tricky nouns. So what does it mean that something's tricky? It means it's a little difficult to understand, or it could be a little confusing. So look at these words here, and what do you think? Which ones are countable and which ones are uncountable? So maybe pause your screen and just think about that a little bit. Okay, did you think of your answers? Let's look at them together. Money. Now you might say, well, money's countable because I can count my money. But to be honest, in an English person's mind, that's not how that works. Money is used to describe coins and paper money and even money of other countries. So really, the amount of money in the world is something that is there's too much of a variety and there's too many options of types of money that it is uncountable. In fact, there's no such word as monies. It's only money. What about coins? Aha, coins are countable. You can have one coin or you could have two coins. And coins are those little round pieces of money that usually are easily countable. They're their own little pieces, and usually they are of a smaller value. Something that causes a little bit of problems is the word bread. Why is bread not countable? It's a little hard to understand, but in an English person's mind, bread is just difficult to quantify. They think of the mass of bread and that you can't really count it. So bread is uncountable. And if you think about it, there's no such word as breads. We always say bread. But now, if the bread is specified by a unit of measure, for an example, loaves of bread or slices of bread, those are countable. So you could say, could I have 2 pieces or 2 slices of bread? In that case, we just counted it. But if you're just asking if there is any bread, we don't say, is there a bread? We say, is there some bread? Because bread is something that is not countable in an English person's mind. What about water? Water, along with all other liquids, is not countable. Why? Because water is made up of so many little particles that it's hard to divide. So when you're talking about general water, juice, wine, we're talking about something that is uncountable. But similarly to the bread, if it's in units, for an example, glasses of water, liters of water, or bottles of water, then those would be countable. Now, what about hair? Well, when we're talking about the hair on our head, here's a question for you. Do you know how much hair you have? How many pieces of hair you have on your head? No one can count the hair on their head, or at least most people can't. So when we're talking about the hair on our head, it really is something that is uncountable. And we don't say the hairs on our head, we say the hair on our head. However, there is a circumstance or a situation where hair is countable. For an example, there's a hair in my sandwich. In that case, it would be countable. Why? Because we're not talking about a whole head of hair. We're just talking about one little strand of hair. So when we're talking about a specific strand of hair, maybe you found a hair somewhere, then that would be countable. And you could say, I found a hair. Our last one we've already touched on a little bit, and it's information. I wrote it again because this is a word that I hear very often is a little confusing for people who are learning English. Information in many other languages is something that is countable, but in English, it isn't. So there's no such word as informations. No, information is always information, and you cannot count it. So we don't have many information or many informations. No, we have a lot of information. All right, now I talked a little bit about many and much, so let's take a look at how that works. As you see here, many is for something that is countable. If we want to ask a question with many, we would ask, how many apples do you want? In this case, the person would give you a number. Oh, I'd like 4 apples, please. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. And again, we can count apples. Another sentence is, I have many friends. If we're talking about it in a more negative way, I have too many friends means that we have 2 more friends than what we can handle. So there's many and too many. And again, friends is something that is countable. The last one is a sentence in a negative form. I don't have many oranges left. What does it mean? The person has oranges, but there's not many left, meaning there's just a few oranges, maybe 1 or 2. Now, many is always used with countable nouns. Let's take a look at much. First of all, a question with much that we all use is, how much is it? Why would it be much in this case? Because we're talking about money. Remember in our previous slide, money is not countable. So how much money is it? In English, we don't say I have much friends, or I have much hope, or I have much information. We don't say that. The only positive sentence that we would use with much is saying if we have too much of something, so more than what we can handle. An example is, I have too much work to do. What does this mean? The person has more work than what they can handle. And work is something that is uncountable, because usually we have too much work and we just can't count it. Okay, let's take a look now at the negative form. In this case, it says, I don't have much bread left. Again, as we saw before, bread is uncountable. What does this sentence mean, though? I don't have much bread left. Is there any bread? Yes, there is. The person's saying that they do have bread, but it's not a lot. It might just be 1 or 2 slices. So again, when do we use many? With countable nouns. When do we use much? With uncountable nouns. And remember, we can't say I have much work. We only use much in a positive form if it's too much. All right, let's go on to our next slide. As you see here, I have an activity for you now. And this activity is for you to try and test out what we just learned and see how well you understood and grasped it. So now, in this case, I hope you have a pen and paper next to you. If you don't, feel free to get one, because in this whole course, we're going to be doing lots of activities. For this first activity, I'm going to ask you to pause your screen and try and think of the words that go in these spaces. Now, I'm just going to give you a little hint. It's not only many and much. You might also have to put the word or the verb to be. So is and are. Okay? So again, is, are, many, much. Those are the 4 words that you will insert. So at this point, pause your screen and do the activity. How did you do? I'm sure you did great. Let's take a look at the answers together. The first one is love is in the air. Why isn't it love are in the air? Because love is uncountable. So uncountable things are only in the singular form. Let's look at the second one. These apples are cheaper than usual. And again, we have are. Why do we choose are? Because apples is plural and it's countable. If a word has a plural form, it usually is a countable word. Let's look at the third one. Platzi has many courses, and that is true. Why did we choose many? Because courses, or course, is a countable noun. In fact, you could have few courses, you could have many courses, you could have 1 course or 2 courses. Let's look at our fourth one. There isn't much information on the subject. So remember, much is often used with a negative form unless we're talking about something that's too much. Again, there isn't much information on the subject. Why is it much? Well, remember, and I repeat it again, information is uncountable. So we wouldn't say there isn't many information. We'd say there isn't much information. Now, I have a question for you. Is the word knowledge countable or uncountable? So do some research on your own or just comment your own personal opinion, but I'd love to see what you come up with in the comment section. So please comment this in the comment section. Our next class is going to be about more quantifiers. In other words, more ways of talking how much and how many things we have. Okay? So I'll see you in the next class. In our last class, we saw how to use many or much. But are there other words that we could use to quantify words, either countable or uncountable? Yes, there are, and we're going to discover them in this class. So let's look at our first slide. Here in the picture, we have some other words that we use to quantify objects or nouns. Now notice that some are only for countable ones, whereas others are only for uncountable ones. Did you notice there's the white circle in the middle? Those ones, the words in there, are for countable or uncountable. And these can be really helpful if you don't really know if something is countable or not. So let's read through them a little bit. So for the countable ones, we have few or a few, or many or not many. What about for the uncountable ones? We have a little, or we have much or not much. What are the ones that could be used for both? Well, these are just some, but we have some, a lot of, no, none, most, and all. So these are words that you can use to describe either countable or uncountable things. Let's look at our next slide. Here we have another activity. So as you see, there's 2 sentences, but there's a word missing. Now there's multiple answers that could fit in these slots here, but pause your screen and try and work on the exercise, and I'll show you the answers in the next slide. How did it go? What were your answers? As you see in the first one, there really is only one answer, and that's because it's a question. Usually when you're offering something to someone, we would say, would you like some bread? Would you like some water? Would you like some apples? We often use some when we're offering something to someone. But look at the second one. Now there were a lot more options. All of the students passed their exam. Some of the students passed their exam. Most of the students passed their exam. Or just a few of the students passed their exam. None of the students passed their exam, or a lot of the students passed their exam. As you see, depending on what the sentence is, or what the results of the exam was, you would also have a different word to put there. So if everyone passed, well, then you say all of the students passed their exams. But if no one passed, you'd say none of the students passed their exams. So having said this, here's a question for you. What is the difference between most of and some of? So think about it and comment what you think below. I'd love to see your answer. In the meantime, we're actually going to discover this very question in the next class. So join me in our next class. Proportions and groups. Why is it important to speak about this? Well, when you're giving information, you often have to discuss how many or how many people did something or the success or the results of something. So, to be able to do this, we need to know how to talk about proportions and groups. So, let's take a look at the vocabulary that we'll learn in this class. We have none of, all of, most of, some of, a few of, and half of. So notice that they all have of, and it's because it's a proportion. It's saying how much of the full amount. So it's very close to being a percentage, but it's less precise than a percentage as well. So remember that as well. Now, what's the difference between these words? What do they mean? The best way of discovering this is actually putting them in a percentage line. As you see here, we have a percentage line, and this is going to help us to understand the difference or the small differences even between these words. The percentage line starts at 0% and it goes up to 100%. For an example, if someone told you that half of the students passed their exam, what percentage would that be more or less? Would it be closer to 0%? Would it be closer to 50%? Or would it be closer to 100%? Well, if someone said half of, that would be 50%. So you can put half of under the 50% mark. Where would you put the other words? So at this point, pause your screen and think of where you would put each one of these words. I'll show you the answers in the next slide. How did you do? I'm sure some of them were really easy for you to do, and maybe others you weren't so sure. So let's take a look at the answers together. If we're talking about 0% of people or 0% of the things, we would say none of. What about 100? 100% would be all of. Let's take a look, though, at the words in between. If someone says that a few of the students, for an example, passed their exam, they're saying that just a small number. And so that would be closer to 0%. But it's not zero. There are some that pass, but they're very few. It's a small number of people. What about if someone says some of the students passed their exam? Well, some is more than a few, so it's quite a bigger number, but it's not as close as half of. Some is still a relatively small number, but it's more than a few of. What if someone said that a lot of the students passed their exam? Well, that would be more than 50%. And if someone says that most of the students passed their exam, it means that there's just a small number that didn't pass their exam. Everyone else passed. So these words are very useful when you're trying to talk about percentages, but in a less, systematic way, when you're giving a general proportion of people or things, and especially when you're talking about results. Let's look at our next slide. Here we get to test a little bit our understanding. So here the question is, what is the percentage? The sentence is, most of the people enjoyed their trip. Would you say that that's 0%, 10 to 20%, 50%, or 75 to 80%? So pause your screen and think of the answer. What answer did you come up with? Did you come up with 75 to 80%? If you did, that's correct. When someone uses the word most of, it means 75, 80%, almost all of the people or all of the objects. So if you see or hear most of, you know that it's a high percentage. Okay, so now tell me about some particularities about your country using the words in class. For an example, most people in my country like to do this, or most people in my country have never been to, and you can go ahead and finish the sentence. I'd love to get to know you, and I'd love to get to know your country as well. So please comment below. In our next class, we're going to discuss all or nothing. So stay tuned for our next class. In our previous class, we saw how to talk about proportions. Let's see a little bit more how we can talk about all or nothing. When we want to talk about all or a complete number, we use the word every. And depending on which word every is joined with, it can mean something different. For an example, there's everything, everyone, everywhere, every day. Which one of these would you use when you're talking about a person? Did you think about everyone? You're correct. You could also use the word everybody. What about if you're thinking about a location or a place? Did you think about everywhere? That would be correct. When we use the word where, we always know that we're talking about a place or a location. And the word everywhere means in every place and in every location there is, and then whatever you're talking about. Let's take a look at no. When we want to talk about the absence of something or something that isn't there, we use the word no. Often it is connected with another word. For an example, no one, nowhere, nothing, none, and nobody. Now remember, when we use the word no, or no one, nowhere, nothing, we put it in a positive sentence structure. So the verb will be a positive verb. For an example, we don't say, I don't see nothing. We say, I see nothing. So the verb is in a positive form. We don't need to have two negatives when it comes to these words. This is important to know, and you'll see why in our further classes. So just remember that. Now, if you're talking about a person, which one would you use? no one, or nobody. And if we're talking about an object that isn't there, we would say nothing. Let's look at our next slide. Here we have two sentences that show the difference between every and no. So everybody or everyone needs a home. Isn't this true? Every single person on this planet needs a place that they can call home for their own mental and emotional health. No one likes to suffer. And this is also true of every person on the planet. There is no one that enjoys suffering. We all want to be happy. Let's look at another way that we can use every. We can talk or use every when we talk about individual people or things. For an example, the sun comes out every day, meaning that Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, every day of the week, all the days the sun comes out and it gives us life. Let's look at the second one. Every child likes to play. And again, we're saying that all the children, every individual child likes to play. Let's look at the other one. Every snowflake is unique. What are we saying here? We could also change this with the word each if we wanted to. Each snowflake or every snowflake is different from another snowflake. So this is another way that we would use the word every on its own. I have a question for you now. What are some generalizations about your country? So everyone in my country does this or likes this, and no one from my country has this or has done this. For an example, I'd love to get to know you and your country a little bit better. I love to travel, and I'd love to get to know your environment and your country a little better. So please comment below. In our next class, we're going to discuss some or any. Some or any? Have you ever been confused by that question? Have you ever wondered, is it some or is it any? You're not alone. These two words are very similar and they're used in similar sentences, so sometimes it can be a little confusing. In this class, we're going to see what the differences are, and we're going to have a few exercises and activities to help you get familiar and comfortable with these words. So as you see here, some is used with positive forms. So in positive sentences, we use the word some. Now remember, some can be for countable and uncountable nouns, and we can also use them in questions. Now here I have an activity where we have three sentences. Which one is a question form? Which one contains a countable noun, and which one contains an uncountable noun? So pause your screen and work on the activity. How did you do? Was it easy to figure this out? I think you did really well. Let's look at them together. Our first sentence is, or better, I should say question, can I have some fruit? This is clearly the question form. Let's look at the second one. I have some apples. Again, apples, one apple or two apples is countable. And for our third one, there's some bread left. Bread, as we saw before, is uncountable. And what does this sentence mean? Remember, if someone's saying that something is left, it means that remaining. Left means remaining. So by saying this, it says there's some bread left. There's not a lot of bread left, but there is bread left. A decent amount, in fact. Let's go on to our next slide. In this slide and this activity too, we're going to look at questions with some. The reason is because it's usually the questions that get people a little confused. What kind of questions can we make with some? Well, can I have some? Could I take some? Could you give me some? Notice the question on the bottom. What do these questions have in common? What do you think? Other than the fact that they all have the word some, they're all requesting for something that is there. So when we use the word some, we're usually asking permission to have something that is available. We know it's there. We just want to know if we can have it. Remember this because this is a big difference when it comes with questions with any. Let's take a look at how any works now. One big difference is that any is in negative forms. For an example, I don't have any, whatever you don't have. Any can be used with countable and uncountable, so you don't have to worry about that. And once again, it's in questions. So let's take a look at an example of all three of these circumstances. Which is which? Once again, pause your screen and do the activity. How did you do? I'm sure you did great in this one too. Let's look at the first sentence. Do you have any fruit? That's the question form. I don't have any apples. Again, apples are countable, but notice that it says I don't have any apples. So this is a negative form sentence, or the verb in the sentence is in the negative form. In our third sentence, it says, there isn't any bread left. Bread, as we saw before, is uncountable. But what does this sentence mean? In this sentence, they're saying that there's no bread remaining. So there was bread, but now there's no more. Let's take a look at our next slide. How do questions with any work? Well, here are a few examples. Do you have any? Aren't there any? Is there any? What do these questions have in common? What do you think? Other than the fact that they have the word any, the meaning of these questions are very similar. The person isn't asking for something. He's first asking if there is something. So when it comes to some, as we said before, the person knows that it's available, but would just like to ask for it. Whereas with any, the person's asking if the object is available. We're going to see this more in our activities later on. Here are some compound words or compound nouns with some. We have someone, something, somewhere, somehow, sometimes, and somebody. Again, which one would you use for talking about a person? Someone or somebody. What about talking about a place? You got it, somewhere. So it's the same as the compound words we saw before with no and every, just that this one has some. Let's take a look now at compound words with any. There's anyone, anywhere, anything, anyhow, anymore, anybody. Again, which ones are about people? You got it, anyone or anybody. What does anymore mean? I don't want it anymore. Anymore explains that, for example, if someone says, I don't want it anymore, the person did want it before, but now the person doesn't want it. So the person will say, oh, I don't want it anymore, or I don't need it anymore. So if you hear someone use anymore, they're telling you that they changed their mind or something, or that their circumstances changed. I don't live there anymore. It means they used to live there, but now they don't. Let's look at our next slide. Here is an example of some differences between some and any. Now, as I said before, some is always with positive sentences and any is with negative sentences. Now, this is where it gets a little tricky. Any can be used with positive sentences, but when that happens, it changes its meaning. For an example, if you say, I don't want anything, you're saying you want nothing. Again, that was a negative sentence because the verb is in the negative form. I don't want anything. If you put it in a positive sentence, for an example, you could say, if someone asks you what you want, maybe off of a menu, oh, anything is fine. Notice that there's no negative verb in that. Anything is fine. Are they saying that they want nothing? No. They're saying that it doesn't matter. They are happy with everything. Aha, this is why, let's say, any gets a little complicated. If it's in a negative sentence, it's very similar to the words that we learned with no, so that something is lacking or missing. If it's in a positive sentence, it's saying that it doesn't matter or something doesn't matter. If this is a little confusing to you right now, don't worry. We have lots of activities that are going to help you out with this. So let's look now at the examples on the slide. The question is, where can I put this box? One answer is, oh, anywhere is fine. What does this mean? Does this mean that the person shouldn't put it in any place? It's all not okay? No. Notice that this is a positive sentence. And as we saw before, when it's a positive sentence, anywhere means that it doesn't matter. So the person's saying it doesn't matter where you put the box. Any place in this room is fine. What about the second sentence? Oh, somewhere on the table would be fine. Again, we're talking about a location, but notice that somewhere is a little bit more specific. In fact, usually it would need a little bit more details than anything would. Where anywhere or anything means that the person doesn't care or it doesn't matter, somewhere usually gives the idea that it does matter, but it's usually pretty flexible. For an example, the table could be a very big table, and it doesn't matter where on the table as long as they put the box on the table. So somewhere is a little bit more specific. It's okay to put it somewhere on the table, in the corner, in the middle, wherever you want, as long as it's on the table. Well, this ends our class on some and any. Now, do you feel like you need to practice that a little bit more? I think so. These are not easy topics to learn. So I'm happy to tell you that our next class will be our very first workshop. And in this course, there are many workshops. So how can you prepare for this workshop? Well, make sure that you have a pen and paper ready and that you're ready and excited to do the activities. All the activities in the workshop are specifically designed for you to be able to practice what you learned in the classes before it. So without further ado, let's go on to our first workshop. Welcome to our very first workshop. I am so excited for you. Are you ready to practice everything we've learned so far? So, before you start, make sure that you have pen and paper and that you're ready to do the activities. These workshops are very important to be able to really practice and feel comfortable with the new things that we learned. Okay, let's look at our first activity here. Here we have 3 words. There's some, any, and every. So, pause your screen and try and see where these words would fit the best. So again, pause your screen and do the activity. How did you do? Let's look at the answers together. The first one is, Anne lost her keys. She looked for them everywhere. Why is everywhere the right option? Because, first of all, it's a positive sentence, and what it's saying is that in every place of the house, and she looked for the keys in all the places of the house. So everywhere would really be the best word to explain that. Let's look at the second one. Anne is frustrated because she can't find her keys anywhere. Why would anywhere be the correct one? Well, notice that it's can't. She can't find her keys anywhere. As we know, any often goes with negative sentences. And what does this mean? Her keys are nowhere to be found. She looked everywhere, but she couldn't find them. All the places that she looked, they weren't there. She can't find them anywhere. Let's look at the third sentence. She doesn't give up. She knows that they must be somewhere. Why would we use somewhere here? Well, the verb for this sentence is positive. She knows that they must be somewhere. Somewhere, as we said before, is also a specific location. So she knows that her keys they have to be in a specific place. They can't just be floating around. They have to be somewhere specific, somewhere that she hasn't looked yet. So I'm sure you did great in this exercise. If you feel like you need more practice, don't worry. We have plenty of exercises in this workshop. Let's go on to the next one. Here we only have 2 sentences to complete. However, they're a little tricky because it's nothing and anything. Now, many people get confused about anything and nothing. Do you remember what the difference is? Well, pause your screen, read the sentences really well, and complete the activity. How did you do? Let's look at the sentences together. I can't see anything here. And the second sentence, there's nothing here. What's the meaning of these sentences? Really, the meaning is the same. They mean the same thing. But why does one have anywhere or anything, and why does one have nothing? Well, in the first one, notice that the verb is in the negative form. I can't see anything. In the second one, there's or there is nothing here. So the verb is positive. So nothing always goes in a positive sentence, whereas anything always goes in a negative sentence when we're talking about the lack of something or the absence of something. And what does it mean? It means the person's trying to see, but he can't see. There's nothing to see. He can't see anything. Let's go to our next slide. Here we have a situation. So the situation is you are at the bakery. You see that there are many baguettes behind the counter. Now, baguettes are very long pieces of bread. They're usually French bread, and they're very tasty. So you want to ask the clerk to sell you some. How do you ask that? So pause your screen, read over the situation again, and write down your answer. How did that go? Did you come up with many different ways of asking? Yeah. I only have 3 here, but there are many other ways that you could ask for these baguettes. So if your answer isn't here and you want to check and see if it's correct, please comment it in the comment section. Ask me if you have any doubts, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. In the meantime, let's look at my answers. One option is, can I have some baguettes? Why would we use some instead of any? Well, we'd use some because, remember, they could see the baguettes. They're in a bakery. They know that the baguettes are there. They can see them. So they're not asking if they sell baguettes. No, they're asking if they can have some. The second one is, can I have some of the baguettes behind you? And the last one is, could you sell me some of those baguettes? Again, we're talking about the baguettes right behind the clerk that the person sees. For that reason, we use some. Let's look at our next slide. Now we have another situation. Again, you're at the bakery. You're looking for baguettes, but you can't find them. You want to ask the clerk if they sell them. How do you ask? Again, pause your screen, read up the situation again, and write down your answer. How did you do? Did you use questions with the word any? If you did, they're probably correct. Let's look at a few options. But again, if you wrote something different and you want to know if it's correct, please comment it in the comment section, leave a question for me, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. So let's look at the answers here. One question is, do you have any baguettes? Are there any baguettes left? Do you sell any baguettes? Let's look at number 2 a little bit more. By saying, are there any baguettes left? What are they asking? Remember, you're in a bakery, so if you use this one, it would be correct. You know that bakeries generally sell baguettes. Maybe you've been there before and you've already bought baguettes there. So in this case, by asking, are there any baguettes left? You're asking if they still have some remaining, or if you have to come by the next day when there's fresh baguettes. Sometimes stores sell out, meaning that they sell, for example, all of their baguettes and there's none left. So that's the difference in this sentence. What were your questions? I would love to know what your answers were. Let's look at our next exercise now. This one is to practice our quantifiers. So there's many, much, and a lot of. Now, put these words where you think best, and sometimes there might be 2 words that fit in the same sentence. So just read it over and see where you would insert these words. So pause your screen and go over the sentences. How did it go? I'm sure you did great. Let's take a look at it together. The ocean has a lot of water. Again, why is it a lot of water and not much? Much is for uncountable nouns, and water is uncountable. Remember that we don't say much, that there's much of something in a positive sentence, unless we're saying that it's too much. In this case, you can't have too much water in the oceans. So the right word would be a lot of. Let's look at the second one. There are many fish in the sea. Why is it many? Well, fish is something that is countable. Let's take a look at the third one. We don't have much, or a lot of milk left. Why in this case? Well, notice that the sentence is in negative form. Don't is a negative verb. So much works well with negative sentences. Also, a lot of is for countable and uncountable. So you could use that as well. Let's look at the fourth one. We don't have many or a lot of bottles left. Why is this one correct? Well, bottles of water are countable because the bottles themselves are countable. So we could use many. And again, as we saw before, a lot of could be for countable or uncountable. Let's look at the last one. And yes, once again, we have information. There's a lot of information online. Why is it a lot of and not many? Do you remember? Information is uncountable. We cannot say informations. But why isn't it much? Again, we don't say there's much information. We can only say there's too much information or have the sentence in a negative form, like I don't have much information. So how did you do? I'm sure you did great. This is the end of our workshop, and I'm sure that it was very helpful to strengthening all these skills that you learned so far. This also marks the end of our first module. Our next module is going to be talking about time, and I know you're going to love it. So join me in our next module. Welcome to Module 2. So what are we going to learn in this module? This whole module is going to be about talking about time. Why is this important? Well, in many aspects of our life, we talk about time. As one English expression is, humans are creatures of habit. What does this mean? It means that all of us, from the most organized person to the least organized person, has a routine. So we talk about our routines. And another thing that we talk about when it comes to time is the experience that we've had. For an example, at a job interview, you might need to talk about your previous work experience. How can you talk about this in a correct way? All of these things and much more will be discussed in this module. So without further ado, let's start with our first class. Our first class is how often. What words can we use to explain how often we do something? I have a list here of some useful vocabulary that you may need to use when talking about this. There's usually, often, sometimes, rarely, never, always, and occasionally. Do you know the exact difference between all of these and when to use them? In our next slide, I have a timeline, or we can call it a percentage line, that can help us out. Now, notice that the line starts at 0% and it finishes at 100%. So what does this mean? Well, if someone says that they never do something, is that 0% of the time, 50% of the time, 70% of the time, or 100% of the time? When it comes to never, we would put it at 0% of the time, which means that they don't do something at all. They never have done it and they just don't have the habit or routine of doing it. Now, can you place the other words in this activity? You might want to pause your screen and work on the activity, and in the next slide, I will have the answers. How did you do? I'm sure you did really well. So as you see, never is at 0%. What did you put at 50%? Notice that in this slide, it's sometimes. Why would sometimes be at 50%? Well, if someone says that they sometimes do something, it means that sometimes yes and sometimes no, and it's kind of half-half. So sometimes would be at 50%. And what's the word that people use when they do something all the time or 100%? Well, that's always. Now, the other words are in between these three words that we just discussed. We have rarely, which means it's not never, but it's really not often. Occasionally is a little bit more often than rarely. Often is more often than sometimes. And usually is when we talk about a regular routine. Now, talking about usually, there is something that we need to keep in mind. Let's take a look at what this is in our next slide. Usually needs to be explained a little bit more. So we can't just say, I usually go to the gym. In English, that doesn't work. We need to explain how often you usually go to the gym. For an example, in the slide, it says, I usually go to the gym 3 times a week. So what does this mean? The person has a regular routine of going to the gym 3 times a week. And unless something happens, like the person gets sick or needs to work more, they have this routine of going 3 times a week to the gym. Let's look at the second sentence. I usually see my family every weekend. Again, this person has the routine of seeing their family every weekend. And the third one, I usually go to the beach in the summer. So the person again is talking about the routine or the habit of going to the beach in the summer months. Let's look at another word that causes problems sometimes. So in this case, we looked at rarely, and rarely is very close to never. So rarely is something as an activity that we don't do often. But now, depending on the age of the person that's speaking or even the country that they come from, they might use a different word. What are other words that mean rarely? As you can see on the slide, there's hardly ever, barely ever, almost never, and seldomly. So don't worry, you don't have to learn all of these or use all of them. You can use rarely or hardly ever. But if you hear someone say these words, know that they mean rarely. Now, how about we practice a little bit what we just learned? In our next class, we're going to have a workshop that discusses all these words that we just learned in this class. So join me for our workshop. Welcome to our second workshop. Are you ready to practice what you learned? So as it says here in the slide, get a pen and paper and be ready to do the exercises. The purpose of these workshops, once again, is to be able to practice everything, to make sure that you understand it well and that you feel comfortable using the new language that we learned. So without further ado, let's start with our first activity. So what do we have to do here? Let's take a look. Here it says, choose the sentence that is the most similar. So the sentence is, Samantha goes to the gym 3 times a year. Would you say that Samantha never goes to the gym? Would you say that she rarely goes to the gym? Or that she occasionally goes to the gym? What would you say? So pause your screen, read it over, and choose your answer. Is this what you chose? Samantha rarely goes to the gym. 3 times a year is not never, because she does go to the gym, but it's not often enough to be something that she occasionally does. In fact, she rarely goes. 3 times a year is not often at all. Here's our next activity. Again, we have Samantha, but we're going to talk about how often she goes hiking. So look at the sentence here. It says, Samantha goes hiking every week. Would you say that she goes hiking sometimes, occasionally, or often? So think about your answer, pause your screen, and we'll see the answer in the next slide. Did you say that Samantha hikes often? If so, you're correct. Every week is a regular routine and means that she often goes hiking. Let's look at the next slide. Again, we have Samantha here, and this time we're going to see how often she goes out for drinks. The sentence says, Samantha will go out for drinks a few times a month. So would you say that she often goes out for drinks, seldomly goes out for drinks, or occasionally goes out for drinks? What do you think? Pause your screen and choose an answer. Did you choose this answer? Did you choose Samantha occasionally goes out for drinks? Yeah, a few times a month is occasionally. It's not very often, but it's also not rarely, nor is it never. So occasionally would be the best option for this sentence. Let's take a look at our next activity. In this activity, we have a schedule. In fact, it's Andy's schedule. So take a look at the schedule and see what he does in his general week. How often does Andy spend time with family? How often does he go jogging? And how often does he work? A few examples of what you could say is, for an example, Andy goes jogging every day, or Andy always goes jogging because he does it every day. You could also use usually by saying Andy usually goes jogging every day. Now, I'd love to see what your answers are. So please comment them in the comment section, and I would love to read them. If you have any questions on whether your answers are right, feel free to ask and I will get back to you as soon as possible. In the meantime, there's also an additional or an extra resource on routines that you can look up. Please go to this extra resource. The reason is that it is going to help you to practice your new language, everything that you learned in this class and the previous class. It'll help you to practice it and also to understand when other people are talking about their routines. So once again, comment below your answers, and I would love to hear also about what you thought about the extra resources. Our next class is going to be about since and for. So join me in our next class. Welcome to our class on since and for. First of all, why do we have a class on since and for? The reason is because many people who are learning English have a hard time, or it's pretty difficult for them to understand when we use since and when we use for. The reason is because we use both of them when it comes to talking about experience or how much time we've done something. And there's really just a small difference between them. So in this class, we're going to see what these differences are. Let's take a look at our first slide. In this slide, we see when we use since. A big important factor when it comes to since is that it focuses on the starting point. For an example, I have been working here since 2011. Notice that we don't know how long the person's been working there. We just know when they started working there. Now, in this case, there's a year, but there might be a date or a very important event. For an example, my neck has continued to hurt or has been hurting ever since I had that accident. Again, the starting point is the accident. And what we're saying is my neck has been hurting since the starting point, or since the accident. So this is when we use the word since. Let's take a look at how we use for. In this slide, we see a little bit more about for. It says that for focuses on the amount of time. So it doesn't focus on when something started, but how long the activity has continued, or the amount of time it's taking or it took, depending on the sentence. An example here is, I have been working here for 3 years. So we know the exact amount of time, but we don't know the exact day or year that it started. We have to calculate it or maybe look it up. So let's look at an activity and see if we can put this into practice. Here we have 2 sentences. Which one needs since and which one needs for? So pause your screen and take a moment to do the activity. Is this what you came up with? Let's look at these sentences together. I have been working here for 7 years. Why is it for? Because the sentence is focusing on the amount of time that this person's been working in their company. Let's look at the second sentence. I have been working here since 2005. Why is it since? Because the sentence is focusing on the year that the person started working there. So we don't know the exact amount of time. We would need to calculate it first to know how long they've been working there. Let's look at our next slide. In this slide, we have 3 sentences, and there's a small difference with each one. Now, pause your screen and read the sentences carefully. In the next slide, I will show you what the differences are. How did you do? Was it easy for you to find the differences? It might not have been easy because they're very small. So let's take a look at the answers together. The first sentence, I have been living in Colombia for 4 years. So as we saw before, by saying 4 years, it's focusing on the amount of time that the person spent living in Colombia. Do you notice, though, the verb structure? It says, I have been living. If someone says that they've been living or doing or working, it means that this action started in the past and is continuing until today, until present. So the person who's talking here has been living in Colombia for 4 years, and they're still living in Colombia today. Let's see how sentence 2 is a little bit different. I have been living in Colombia since 2017. Like we saw in our previous slides, by saying since 2017, the person is focusing on the starting point or the year that they moved to Colombia. But here's the question. Is this person still living in Colombia? Yes, because it says I have been living. In fact, since usually is always used when the person is continuing or still doing the action that they're describing. So this person lives in Colombia now, lives in Colombia today, and he started living in Colombia in 2017. Now let's look at the third sentence and see how it's a little different. I lived in Colombia for 4 years. By saying 4 years, we see the amount of time the person spent living in Colombia. But did you notice the verb? It says, I lived in Colombia. This means that the person used to live in Colombia, but doesn't live in Colombia anymore. So you see the differences? In sentence 1 and sentence 2, we see that the person is still living in Colombia now. In sentence 3, the person no longer lives in Colombia or doesn't live in Colombia anymore. But now I have a question for you. How long have you been in your current job or your current school? I'd love to see your beautiful comments below, and please use the same sentence structures that we learned in this class. Our next class is going to be about yet and still, so join me in that class.